And I will begin. Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Blanchard. I'm a member of the Voter Services Committee for the local League of Women Voters. We are the League of Women Voters of Northern Lower Michigan, and we are pleased to present this update on the changing status of voting rights initiatives and legislation in Michigan. It is an educational program with funds provided from the League of Women Voters Michigan Education Fund. It does not advocate action on the material provided, and the PowerPoint has been updated as needed because voting rights in Michigan are in a state of flux. We encourage people to keep checking on your trusted sources of information, including the League of Women Voters Michigan website. This PowerPoint is being presented around the state by leagues, and we have a script that helps us make it universal and accurate in all the places it's being presented. So I hope I don't sound plotting, but I do want to read the material provided and not just speak off the cuff, because it's important that it be accurate and similar across all of the presentations. So thank you for your patience with that. The purpose of the League of Women Voters Education Fund is to provide nonpartisan information about candidates and ballot issues to Michigan voters, to provide information about the mechanics of registering and voting, and to encourage citizens to participate in civic life and provide to them nonpartisan information about important non-ballot issues. Voting rights. In 2018, the League of Women Voters, the ACLU, the NAACP, and others supported the Promote the Vote ballot proposal that amended the Michigan Constitution. Voting rights are very popular in Michigan, and Promote the Vote, Proposal 3, passed overwhelmingly, 67% to 33% of the voters in 80 of 83 counties supported that legislation. And in addition, the legislature passed and the governor signed Public Acts 350 through 354 in 2018 to provide for online voter registration. So as a result, we have new voting rights that we want to highlight. Eligibility to vote is unchanged. You are eligible to vote if you are on election day, a Michigan resident, and a resident of your own city or township for 30 days, a US citizen, at least 18 years of age, and not currently serving a sentence in jail or prison. New is same-day voter registration. In fact, you may register anytime up to 8 p.m. on election day. Registering early, of course, offers more choices. You can do that in person at your local city or township, at the Secretary of State's office, or at a state agency that provides public assistance. And you may register online at michigan.gov with a Michigan driver's license or state ID and the last 4 digits of your social security number until 2 weeks before election day. And you may use a mail-in application at least 2 weeks before election day. If you register in person, you do need to bring proof of residency, and that can be any of the following: the Michigan driver's license or state ID, a current utility bill or bank statement, a paycheck or government check, and other government documents like a passport, and electronic versions of those are okay. Voting before election day. All registered voters have a right to vote by absentee ballot, thanks to Proposal 3. You request an absentee ballot through an application, and a signature is required on that application. Absentee ballots are available 40 days prior to the election. You can return those ballots up until 8 p.m. on election day, and military and overseas voters, of course, can vote absentee. You can vote in person at your clerk's office or satellite office before election day, 40 days prior to the election day, and our local clerks can tell you the specifics of how you do it here in Emmett County. And if you're not sure if you're registered, you can go to www.mi.gov/vote to make sure you're registered. Voting on election day. You can register to vote at the clerk's office on election day if you're not registered and have moved. And if you are registered, you must vote in your assigned precinct. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Your ID is required, or you can sign an affidavit. And absentee ballots must be submitted to the clerk or put in a drop box by 8 p.m. that day. Michiganders supported the 2018 Voting Rights Proposal 3 to expand voting rights, and possibly, as a result of Promote the Vote, more people voted in 2020 despite COVID than in 2016. 5.5 million people voted, more than 652,000 in 2016. This represents 71% of those 18 or over, compared to 63% of voters voting in 2016. In 2020, 3.3 million voters, 2/3 of voters, voted absentee. Very popular. In 2020, we had a close election for president in Michigan, and there has been much controversy. As you can see, we had a closer election in 2016 than in 2020, but we had no drawn out campaign saying there was voter fraud. Post-election audits of the 2020 general election were the most extensive in Michigan history. 3 types of audits were conducted. Precinct procedural audits. These were conducted primarily by county clerks and involved the review of more than 200 in-person voting precincts across the state. They are designated to ensure that election officials and poll workers followed the correct procedures in conducting elections in these precincts, which required pre-election requirements be fulfilled and that required records were maintained. The audits also included a full hand count of paper ballots cast in the U.S. Senate race in each of those 200 precincts where the audits were conducted. Absentee counting board audits. New for 2020, the Bureau of Elections worked with city and county election officials to review records and procedures in absentee voter counting boards in 4 large jurisdictions. The audits focused on determining how many absentee voter counting boards were out of balance and could have been reconciled with additional review, and identifying the reasons why counting boards were out of balance. The third type were risk limiting audits. The state conducted a risk limiting audit exercise of the presidential elections statewide. Approximately 18,000 ballots were randomly selected from more than 1,300 local jurisdictions statewide, and the results of the randomly selected ballots were compared to the statewide tabulated total. The Bureau of Elections also conducted a full hand count audit of all presidential ballots in Antrim County. Running of elections is a local responsibility held by Michigan's 1,520 city and township clerks, along with their staff, volunteers, and poll workers. They have extra people they have hired to work in polling places and perform other election functions. The auditing of elections, which includes review of the city and township clerks who run the elections, are performed by county and state officials. There were numerous court cases that found no evidence of voter fraud, and the Senate Oversight Committee, chaired by Senator Ed McBroom, a Republican, released a report that said the election was safe and secure. The reaction to the 2020 election has resulted in over 100 bills introduced in the Michigan House of Representatives and over 100 introduced in the Michigan Senate. And some of those bills include moving the primary election August to June, training challengers, flagging dead voters, requiring signature verification training, changing laws for registration, changing how you administer election, increasing the power of partisan challengers, and changing how elections are certified. And this would be nice if it came with the little song about how a bill becomes a law that lots of us used to watch in the 80s. But as you can see, the bill goes from the Senate Election Committee to the Senate for a vote. When it's passed in the Senate, it goes to the House Elections and Ethics Committee. From that committee back to the entire House for a vote, or on to, excuse me, the House for a vote. Once passed in the House, it goes back to the Senate. The Senate sends it to the governor. The governor has the option to sign or veto. And if she vetoes, the legislature can try to override the veto by 2/3 votes. And in the Senate, that is 24 votes to override of the 38 senators. And in the House, 73 to override of the 110 members of the House of Representatives. Senators Ruth Johnson, Ed McBroom, Curtis Vanderwall, and Paul Wojno make up the Senate Elections Committee. They started hearings on these bills in April. It is continuing. They've taken testimony on all 39 bills. Most are still in committee. 9 have moved. The bills that passed the House and Senate were vetoed by Governor Whitmer on October 3rd, 15, and 29th. The governor said the bills perpetuated the, quote, big lie, unquote, and that every citizen has a guaranteed right to vote. The 8 bills vetoed dealt with expansion of polling places, blocking third parties from accessing the qualified voter file, banning voting machines from being connected to the internet, requiring county clerks to remove deceased voters from the qualified voter file, establishing a timeline for completing review of initiative petitions, establishing new identifying information in order to register to vote or obtain an absentee ballot, prohibiting the Secretary of State and clerks from mailing absentee ballot applications unless requested, and prohibiting private nonprofit funding for elections. You can get copies of the bills and the current status of the bills and the league's position on the bills all at the League of Women Voters Michigan website. You can look up minutes and testimony by going to the senate.michigan.gov site or house.michigan.gov site. And you can look up the bills and see analysis at the michigan.legislature.gov site. What can you do? Stay informed. Information changes regularly on the League of Women Voters Michigan site. And you can go to the Secretary of State fact check site to learn how the 2020 election was safe, secure, and fair. I will add one little thing. I did go to the site. I was curious about what it would say. And I learned there that the Secretary of State uses information from the Social Security Death Index every week to cancel people from the qualified voter file already. I didn't know that. Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson also has an agenda she would like passed. However, it has not been taken up by the Michigan House or Senate. It deals with equitable access, strong infrastructure, and secure elections. And recently, some House bills have been introduced that make some of these same changes. You can see in the equitable access, requiring absentee ballot applications be mailed to registered voters every federal election cycle, requiring counting of ballots postmarked by election day or received shortly after, establish early in-person voting at clerk's offices and satellite offices prior to election day, making election day a state holiday. To ensure strong infrastructure, she would propose allowing the processing of absentee ballots 2 weeks prior to election day, providing an additional week for a county canvass, allowing recounts of precincts. For clerical errors, consolidating May and August elections into one June election and providing dependable funding for local election officials. Securing election, her proposals would be to prohibit deceptive election practices, prohibiting open carry of firearms within 100 feet of the voting location, and requiring election challengers and election worker training. So some of that is similar to what you saw in the House and Senate legislation that was highlighted. On September 2nd, Secure My Vote submitted an initiative for approval prior to beginning to collect signatures. The new initiative position seems to be a response to the 2020 election and the belief by some that there was voter fraud. On September 8th, the Secure My Vote group submitted the petition to the State Board of Canvassers. The board approved the form and the summary, and the petitions are now being circulated. They must gather 340,047 valid signatures in order to have the State Board of Canvassers approve the petition. And that number is the equivalent of 8% of the voters who voted for the governor in 2018. This process is used to enact a law that the governor cannot veto. Once the signatures are verified, the legislature can vote to enact the law or put it on the next general election ballot. And I made a note to myself. I learned that all states in the US had an increased turnout in 2020. 13 states had a larger increase than Michigan did. So we were in the top 15 of states for increased voting. Here's the timeline for the petition to become a law. As we said, they submitted the draft to the Board of Canvassers. The canvassers approved it. That's the yellow square. The green, gathering the signatures they're doing now. They have 180 days. That will be up in March. The Board of Canvassers will validate the signatures and the law will be sent to the legislature, the proposed law, excuse me. The legislature will have 40 days to adopt it or decide to put it on the general election ballot in November. And if the law goes into effect, either of those ways, legislative approval or voted by the people, the governor cannot veto it. The proposal does some of the following: mandates that people disclose a partial social security number when registering to vote. It restricts options for registered voters to verify their identity. Acceptable forms of photo ID would include a driver's license, state ID, passport, military ID, travel ID, or student ID issued by a university, junior college, or community college. If not, the voter is given an ID only provisional ballot. It requires voters applying for an absentee ballot to include their driver's license or state ID number or the last 4 digits of their social security number on that absentee ballot application. It prohibits election officials from sending or providing absentee applications unless voters ask for them. And that includes not having the application on their websites. It bans charitable contributions, including volunteer time to help administer elections. It states that drop boxes will close at 8 p.m. on election day. That is the current law. It mandates that clerks' offices be open 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. for the 5 weekdays leading up to the election, or to accept the ballots, or that drop boxes are made available for returning ballot. It spends $3 million to provide free photo identification to those who declare a need. And this would be a new appropriation. It allows the legislature to adopt the legislation without a vote of the people, and it blocks a people's referendum vote after adoption. Currently, Michigan voters can sign an affidavit affirming their identity. And if their names are in the qualified voter file, they can vote. So just over 11,000 people used that affidavit in 2020, which is 0.02% of voters. It adds that if you have no ID to complete a provisional ballot, you have to go to the clerk's office within 6 days to verify your identity. 7 states have strict voter ID laws like this proposal: Arkansas, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. There are penalties for false information now. perjury punishable by a fine up to $1,000 or jail up to 5 years for illegally voting. 465 cities, townships, and counties did receive funding from nonprofits to help with elections in 2020. Voters cannot vote to repeal this law because it contains the allocation of the $3 million to help get IDs. And this is an unnecessary allocation because there is currently provisions for hardship. There are currently provisions for hardship. The current cost of a state ID is $10. An official copy of a birth certificate can cost anywhere from $15 to $30, depending on the state. Fees for a new passport, if someone were to choose that as their ID, can be $110 to $135. And the price of a replacement naturalization certificate or certificate of citizenship is $345. But again, current cost is $10 and there are provisions for hardship. So what this 3 million allocation does is prevent a voter referendum or a veto by the governor. You can see the 19 states that have passed laws restricting voting rights in this map. There are bills moving at the federal level that may impact the laws passed in the 19 states in the previous slide, and also the Secure My Vote if it's adopted. The House has passed HR 1, which is called the For the People Act, and HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And we're waiting to see if the Senate will pass either bill or the new Freedom to Vote bill. Again, what can you do? Stay informed about the status of legislation and see actions alert on the leagueofwomenvoters.org site. That's the national site. And educate people that the 2020 election was safe, secure, and fair. And the good information for that is on the Secretary of State's site, fact checks at michigan.gov. There has been a lot of misinformation and disinformation about voting. Misinformation is sharing of false information without intent of harm. Misinformation can spread when journalists misinterpret something or fail to verify a source's claim. It can also happen on social media. Well-intentioned individuals can easily share or like content that is outdated or misleading and do so unintentionally. Disinformation is creating and sharing false information with the intent to harm. Bad actors who spread disinformation online have different motivations. It could be voter suppression in community of color, or spreading mistrust in democracy. But the common goal is to have their bad information reach the mainstream media. How do you spot disinformation online? Consider the source. Does the URL look strange? Check the About page on their website. Check the date. Is the story old news? Sharing out-of-date information may not match current events. Cross-check information. Are reputable news sources reporting the same story? Read past the headline. What's the whole story? Sometimes a deadline doesn't match the content. A headline, excuse me, not a deadline. Question emotionally charged content. Disinformation intends to sow division by getting us angry or sad through images and memes. How do you combat mis and disinformation? Never quote the bad information. This only helps to spread the bad information wider, and studies show that repeating bad info, even to debunk it, makes people more likely to remember the bad info and not the good. Refer to the bad information without repeating it. Say, some bad actors are making false claims about the legitimacy of the 2020 election, rather than saying, Representative XYZ says that thousands of ballots were stuffed into an election office. That isn't true. Focus on providing the correct information, and if possible, include trustworthy sources for where to learn more. Inoculation messaging. Think of good information like a vaccine, which we're all learning all about. You want to proactively inoculate against anticipated problematic content before it spreads. It cannot be said enough. Do not repeat or quote bad information. The method of showing myth versus fact only spreads the myth further. Find ways of calling out the bad information without repeating it. Never doubt what a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens, that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. I thank people who might have logged in on Zoom. I thank the guests who came to this room and did not object to me removing my mask. We're distanced here at the library, and we'll take questions. And if I don't hear any online, I will stop the sharing of the information and we'll just talk here in the library. And thank you, library, very much for helping us do these two presentations. And they were identical. This one's being recorded and will be shared on the League of Women Voters website.